Okay, several years back, I was lucky enough to have a position working for a professional football club, Brighton Hove Albion Football Club, as their sports scientist. And one of my roles there was to advise on all the geeky stuff, really. So I used to look at ways to optimise the nutrition of the players. I used to look at ways to enhance recovery, all that sort of thing. And while I was there, I was asked to research what's the best meals for the players that we can advise the players to eat before a training session. And I looked at multiple studies, and the key thing that came out to me at the time was actually a big part of this is personal preference. And this, you'll see this a lot with the sports science world, that our own personal preferences and individualization will account for a lot. It will have a real significant effect. However, there are still some things we can pluck from it that a bit more generic. So for a start, you want to eat a meal that is balanced. So if you've got a game in the evening, for example, your last meal that you have prior to the game wants to have some proteins, some good fats, and some carbohydrates. And you need to select good sources. So we're looking at lean proteins, we're looking at our good fats, like our polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats. We want to look at getting our whole grain, unrefined carbohydrates, like brown rice, quinoa, that sort of thing. And what that meal will do is give us slow release of energy, so that when it comes to the training session or the game, we've got our energy, and we haven't had what's called an insulin dump, where we've had a surge of energy and then suddenly it's gone. So that's what you're looking for, a balanced meal leading up to the game. Now, how close should you have that meal to when you're training or when you're competing? Well, that's very much dependent on the person's digestive system, but generally, most people need to allow between 2 to 3 hours prior to competing or training for the meal to be digested well enough that it's not going to come back up, basically. So for most people, it's 2 to 3 hours for a large meal. Now, there are other foods you can eat, within the hour. Things like bananas. I mean, you look at tennis players; they eat bananas while they're actually playing. So my advice would be eat a balanced meal with proteins, fats, and carbs. Opt for unrefined sources of carbs that are complex and whole grain. Allow 2 to 3 hours between having that meal and actually competing. And if you do find that you still need to have a little bit more food later on, look for stuff that's very easily digestible, like things like bananas, some fruit juices and things like that will obviously give you some quickly accessible carbs, but just don't have too many of those because you don't want to get that insulin dump that we talked about previously. So that's my advice on eating prior to competition and staying fueled.